You're listening to Radical Free Speech Radio, KPFK in Los Angeles.
Good evening, or should I say good afternoon. It's just about 2 p.m. in Los Angeles, California. My name is Garland Nixon, and I'm on every Monday from 2 to 3 p.m. Pacific time. Having fun, talking about who knows what, having lots of guests on, and certainly today we're going to be taking some calls starting at about 20 after. If you want to follow me online at Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, just plain old Garland Nixon on Facebook, my YouTube channel where I talk lots of YouTube-y kind of stuff. And of course, Rockfin, which is like YouTube, only better, ROKFIN, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon. And I really appreciate this. I give out my email address, and this is my true email address. It's GarlandN, that's my first name and the first letter of my last name, garlandn@gmail.com. And I get lots of great emails from guests. From listeners, people that love the show, people that hate the show. But, in fact, you know what I say for callers? If you like the show, if you agree with me, you get a minute. If you disagree with me, you get 2 minutes, because that's how you grow. That's how you grow. All right. Speaking of growth, we must grow our minds by learning new things. I say this, I consider myself an intellectual, and here's what I mean. Not because I have any more brain computing power than anyone else, but being an intellectual is how you come to your conclusions and how you hold on to them and whether you hold on to them. And that has to do with constantly learning and keeping an open mind. Well, our guest today, Caleb Maupin, is a radical journalist and political analyst who lives in New York City. He's originally from Ohio. He studied political science at Baldwin Wallace College. In addition to his journalism, analysis, and commentary, he's engaged in political activism. He's worked against police brutality, mass incarceration, and imperialist war. He works to promote revolutionary ideology and to support all who fight against the global system of monopoly capitalist imperialism. Sounds like a man after my own heart. Caleb Maupin, welcome to KPFK Newsview.
Sure. Glad to be here.
You know, Caleb, I'm a big believer in, and I've talked about this on this show, if we know something or if we believe something, how do we know what we know? Why do we believe what we believe? And I remember watching in 2008, there was, on the road, I was watching some show, and it was, I think, believe it or not, it was Nancy Pelosi's daughter had done this, was doing this documentary thing. And I'm watching it. And they're talking to somebody on the, it might have been 2012, whatever. They're talking to somebody on the ground, and this person's at a rally, and they say, Obama, have a shirt that it's handwritten, Obama's a socialist. And she says to the person, what's a socialist? And the person goes, let me call my brother-in-law. He'll know. And I thought to myself, that goes against everything that I believe in. And I find, but, Caleb, I've been doing, as you know, I've been doing talk radio since really having my own shows since 2006 on Pacifica, right? And I find that people who have the strongest feelings about things, people who are absolutely convinced, oftentimes know the least. So, Caleb, that's a whole lot of talking. Now let's get back to your knowledge. Socialism, that's a word we hear. I hate socialism. That person's a socialist. Socialism destroys everything. Capitalism is wonderful. You're a person who seems to have dedicated your life to advocating for socialism. I really speak of the word. I've traveled to South America and been to some of the countries and talked to the people there. But there are two words I want people to understand because I want to understand them. Imperialism and socialism. And I believe they're inextricably linked. Let's start with imperialism. What it is, how it works, what people need to know about imperialism.
Well, the most important thing to know about imperialism is that it's not a verb. It's not something you do. It is a system. It's not a policy. It's a system. It is a global economic setup where banks and corporations based in the Western countries dominate the world, and they keep the world poor. They hold back economic development so that they can stay at the top of the pyramid. It's about keeping the world poor so that a small minority of banks and corporations, oil monopolies, big, huge multinationals, they can stay rich. Imperialism is when the British Empire went to India and they burned down all the textile looms and they forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain. Imperialism is when NAFTA went to Mexico, and the people of Mexico have been growing their own food for thousands of years since before Columbus came. But with NAFTA, the American agribusiness got in there. They put all the local farmers out of business, and now the people of Mexico have to import their food from American big box, huge corporations. That's imperialism. Imperialism is the fact that Nigeria is a country on the African continent that exports a huge amount of oil, more oil than any other African country. Yet, if you go to Nigeria, you will find a very low life expectancy, a very high infant mortality rate, a very high rate of illiteracy among the population in such a wealthy country, such a vital commodity, oil, that is so valuable in our world economy centered around fossil fuels. Yet the people who live in the country that has the most of it in all of Africa are living in extreme poverty. That's imperialism. Imperialism is capitalism in its monopoly stage, the domination of the world by huge multinational corporations that are essentially making and keeping the world poor.
That brings the I guess a parallel question that is important, that is critical, particularly in the United States, because we are fed a particular ideology, and that's the question that comes to. It's a question that is important to answer, and that is, why is it that some countries are rich and some countries are poor? And I tell you why I say that. Because you have so many people throughout the West. And here's what they believe. Well, our country is richer because we are intellectually, we are culturally, we are, you know what I mean? We are superior to these poor countries. Therefore, it is almost like a natural organic thing. It's almost like an act of God that our country has lots more money and that country is poor because we're just superior to them in so many ways. Your thoughts on, and everybody knows that's the unspoken things throughout the U.S. and throughout the West. Well, those poor African countries in this country, they're just behind us intellectually, they're just behind us culturally, etc. Your thoughts on that, and through the lens of imperialism?
Well, that is the impression that you would get if you listen to American media and the discourse that we get in the United States. But the reality of world history, if you really consume and take the whole picture, is very different than that. For example, when my ancestors were living in caves in Europe, the people on the African continent were building the pyramids. And you can look at the great achievements throughout every corner of the planet. Human beings are capable of doing great things. And if you look at what was done in ancient Iraq and Mesopotamia, if you look at what was done by China and their 5,000-year-old civilization, the printing press was invented on the Korean Peninsula. Did you know that? It was the Korean people who had the first printing press. So this notion that Western countries are at the center of the world economy now because there's just something inherently naturally superior about them, this isn't the reality. It's just malarkey. And the reason that they're at the center of the world economy right now is because there is a global economic system which really sprung from Europe starting in the 1880s, 1890s, which is centered not on developing countries around the world by trading with them, but on the opposite. Free trade keeps countries poor. And that is the global system of imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage.
I would, in fact, a book that I read, I would like to say that I read. I didn't really read it. I listened to it on, I actually bought it on CD and listened to it. I would commend to people, and it's called Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fate of Human Society. It's a short history of everybody for the last 13,000 years. It's a guy by a guy named Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And that's a really good book that talks about a lot of that kind of stuff. I've heard you talk of a particular anecdote of when you were very young. I believe it was Ecuador. Was it Ecuador you went to?
Sure. Yeah. When I was 12 years old, I went to Ecuador. My dad he had like a side gig, like leading nature tours in the Galapagos Islands. And so I was 12 years old. I'm from a small town in Ohio, never been outside of the United States before, but I got on a plane with my dad and I went to Ecuador. And it was 1999. I'm giving my age away, but that was 1999. And I got off this plane in Ecuador. And outside the airport in Quito, Ecuador, was just crowds of desperately poor, hungry, starving people. And I was just shocked. I had never seen that level of extreme poverty before. I was just in shock. I didn't know what was going on at the time. I know now that Quito, Ecuador, the capital city, was where all the people throughout the country who had lost their farms and lost their land in the countryside were fleeing to. And that basically Quito, Ecuador had been forced, or Ecuador, the country, had been forced to adopt neoliberal reforms. They had been forced to give up their own currency by the IMF and the World Bank. And they were, privatizing their oil. They'd sold their oil company off, their state-run oil company off to American corporations. And the country had been wrecked, and they were experiencing a man-made famine created by imperialism. And hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing the country. People from the rural areas were fleeing into the cities, and that's what I was seeing. And this was neoliberalism. This was the result of free trade economic policies forced on Ecuador to crush their economy. In order to make profits for Western banks and corporations. But, I went back to Ecuador in 2013, years later, after Rafael Correa, the socialist president, had been in office. And what I saw was a completely different country. I saw paved roads. I saw barely any homeless people the whole time I was there. I saw so much development. And things had completely changed. And I saw a lot of Chinese businesses, and I saw a lot of Chinese cars on the highway. And Ecuador had broken free to some degree or other from the domination of Wall Street and imperialism. And as a result, it was not the country I saw when I was 12 years old in 1999. In 2013, I saw a country that had started out on a course of independent development. And that course had largely involved taking control of its own resources, asserting central planning and control over its economy. Cooperating with Russia and China and Cuba and Venezuela on the Bolivarian path to socialism. And so, Ecuador is a great case study. If you look at what they were during the free market years in the 90s, you look at what they are today as a result of what President Correa started, it's a great case study in socialism.
When I was in my travels to South America, I didn't understand what it was that the people wanted. I heard the word socialism, but, I was able to travel out into small villages, hours and hours from the major cities, where you really talk to the people. Two things I was shocked. Let me give you an example, Venezuela. I was surprised that I went out to these small villages with very poor people out in the middle of nowhere, how much they knew about politics and history. It was incredible. They knew way more than Americans inside a major city here. And I was told that that was part of Hugo Chavez's movement, was to teach the people history, to teach the people about these things. They knew the word neoliberal. They knew what it meant. It was amazing to see the level of political sophistication from people in these small towns and villages on the side of a mountain in the middle of nowhere in Venezuela. Your thoughts?
Well, and that's because, I've been to Venezuela as well, and I think it's just an undisputed fact that Hugo Chavez and now Maduro wouldn't be in power for a minute if there wasn't a huge, well-organized bulk of the population that had their back and was behind them. And that's a stark contrast between our political system and theirs, because our leaders depend on us not being educated about politics. Our leaders want us, not engaged, just kind of, out, doing our own thing, not thinking about politics. They want us asleep. But in Venezuela, for that government that is up against Wall Street and up against the big banks and up against the richest people in Venezuela, a populist, working class, socialist government, for them to stay in power, they need a highly tuned in, well-organized population. And Hugo Chavez, he did these nightly broadcasts when he was president, where he would read art and literature. He would engage with his audience about world history and economics. And he mobilized the public to bring them into politics. And that's one thing about every anti-imperialist country. Venezuela certainly has a high level of free speech, and, there's opposition, protesting there. But even some of the more authoritarian socialist countries like North Korea or Iran or China, those countries, I would argue, are more democratic than Western capitalist societies are, because the population is involved in the government process. Those governments wouldn't stay in power for a minute if they weren't relying on the fact that they have a very, very well-organized population. The Chinese Communist Party has 90 million members. Every neighborhood, every apartment building, there's meetings going on saying, how can we advance the goals of the party and move socialism along? How can we improve things in the country? How can we carry out the agenda that our leaders have put forward? How can we engage with our leaders about how to change things and adjust, and adjust the program to benefit the population? democratic participation and involvement with the population is one thing that socialist and anti-imperialist governments really depend on in order to stay in power, whereas the governments here in the West, they do the opposite. They don't want that.
One of the things that I noticed in some of the South American socialist countries is that I was always led to believe, okay, they're just repressive and the poor people are just huddled around in circles with their heads down, nibbling on bread, hoping to have some water every now and then, and hoping the government doesn't kill them. And when I got there, I found that, well, for instance, in Venezuela, I didn't know, I talked with the people, and I had an interpreter, but my interpreter was from Denver. It wasn't like, it was a government interpreter. But at any rate, I didn't realize they have one of the most progressive constitutions on earth. And the way they got the Constitution was they had meetings, local meetings with people all over the country, including the indigenous areas. The indigenous people in Venezuela that live like out in the Amazon, et cetera, have their own section of the Constitution when it comes to workers' rights. If you look at the Venezuelan Constitution, there is nothing that I've seen that can compare as far as how progressive it is. But when you look into the history, you find out it's that way because the people of Venezuela were allowed in small grassroots groups to write it themselves, to send it all up together, to have it put together. And darn it, they wrote their own constitution. And one of the things that I found out with Juan Guaido and his group is they want to take over Venezuela. And the first thing they want to do is get rid of the Constitution. Your thoughts, Caleb?
Absolutely. And that Constitution is widely read, the people in the country like wave it around, it is like a symbol of the revolution. And Chavez, he enacted that constitution after the country had horrendous mudslides. There were horrendous mudslides after heavy rains when he was first president. And so usually the military in Venezuela had just been used to, to break strikes or for, military interventions, et cetera. But he used the army to help the population. And he whipped up this spirit of patriotism where people were like, let's help our communities. And he formed a network of Bolivarian circles that were formed, to kind of support the work of the military, to relieve the people that had been hit by those mudslides and kind of work in terms of a natural disaster for the good of the country. And it was something very, very different. The fact that you had a president who was on TV every night telling the country how we're going to deal with this national disaster, using the military and then building like a network among the population to deal with the crisis. That was something very, very different. And it was in the aftermath of that they passed their new Bolivarian constitution for the country. And it was ratified because the country was just moved. They said, this is a leader who gets things done. We've needed this for a long time. And you'll recall that originally Hugo Chavez said he wasn't for socialism or capitalism. He was for the third way, what was best for Venezuela. But after he'd been in office for a few years, they attempted a military coup against him that was staged by the United States, where they, arrested him and dragged him out of the presidential palace and such. And then it was the rank and file soldiers who rose up and supported him, and the labor unions. And about a year after he was brought back to power after that temporary coup, at that point, he came in and he said, we want to move Venezuela towards socialism. And they've proceeded to do that since then.
Let me tell you a story. I interviewed some soldiers and some older people who were former soldiers, and they told me, I don't want to make this all about Venezuela, but it's a Bolivarian socialist country. They told me that they said, well, you got to understand something, basically. In South America, one of the ways that the United States maintains power, oftentimes in this country, it's a white minority, and it is a Spanish white European minority that was left behind as a ruling elite class, and that the majority of the people are dark and indigenous people or former slaves, and that in Venezuela, as in many other countries, in order to go to a military academy, you had to be white. So the leaders of the military were all white. Therefore, the United States would control the countries via a white-led military. They could overthrow a government anytime they want. And that one of the things Hugo Chavez did was change that so that people who are Black and indigenous could go to the military academies and move up in the military. And then the military was not controlled by the U.S., the U.K., the external colonial forces. And that was what made it so difficult for the U.S. to overthrow, or impossible, basically, for the U.S. to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution, the revolutionary government. Caleb.
Oh, sure. And that, Chavez comes out of the military, and the military is this essential, an element of the revolution there. And he changed the way the military works. I mean, the military in Venezuela now gets trained in Cuba. They have political classes in the military where they learn about Marxism and socialism. And that Chavez, because he was this well-respected military leader in the country, he was trusted by a lot of the people in the military. And he himself is of Afro-Venezuelan heritage. He's not white himself, and that was important, I think, winning the trust of a lot of the population and really changing things. And that, I guess, throughout the history of Latin America over the past 50, 60 years, the United States has often aligned itself with that white minority, that ultra rich landowning Spaniard descended group of people. And those folks are not very popular these days in South and Central America. Those folks, with the racism, with the elitism. I'll never forget a conversation I had when I was in college. I remember I was in college and there were a group of students from Brazil who were attending the college I went to. And I asked them, well, what do you think of Lula da Silva, who was the president of Brazil? And they said to me, oh, he's awful. He's horrible. And I said, what do you mean? I said, well, did you know he used to be a delivery man? He used to deliver boxes for a living. It's so shameful for Brazil to have someone who used to be a delivery man running the country. I mean, it's just horrible, to have a poor person, a person who delivered boxes run the country. And I was like, wow, okay. And I said, well, if he's so bad, why does he win the election? And they said, well, the reason that he wins the elections, they said, is there's all these people in Brazil who are uneducated and poor, and they all get to vote. We have this rule in Brazil that you're required to vote. And so that all these people that shouldn't be voting, all these ignorant, poor people, they all vote. And I said, okay, but why do they vote for him? I asked. And they said, because he gives them all jobs. He gives them all jobs. That's why they vote for him.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let me say this. When you go to the countries, you go to Nicaragua, I remember I went to this, it was called a socialist village. Basically, it was a gigantic apartment complex, the size of a small to medium town. And when I came to I found out that those were the houses that were given away free to poor people. And I asked about it. I said, oh, okay, how's it work? And they said, well, you apply with the government and they give them to women with children get first. And then every week they give you a certain amount of free food. I said, what about electricity and things like that? They said, oh, no, you don't pay for that stuff in this country. It's considered a human right. And I started thinking to myself and realizing, no wonder the United States is so opposed to Bolivarian socialism. They're like giving free houses to poor people who had been left behind. What most Americans don't know is, why are there all these poor people? Because the U.S. have been stealing their oil for the last literal century, running the country, slaughtering people and stealing their oil for the last century. And we created an environment where there's a lot of poor people. And now Chavez, then Maduro comes in and says, look, we're going to give some things. They showed me these, they're like these, the things that, like when you go on a ski lift, and they've got these ski lift things that come into the main city of Caracas, and they're like the poor people in the mountains. So they can come in, they ride these things in, they can go to the market, they can go to jobs, they don't cost anything. Before that, they had no way to get into the markets from the city. So from the mountains, the poor people that live in the mountains. And I saw all of these things that were done specifically to help poor people that didn't charge these poor people any money for that and gave them new opportunities. I thought, no wonder they're supporting these people. Caleb.
Indeed. And bringing people into the political process and empowering people and making sure people have what they need to survive. I mean, that is very much what socialism is all about. And yeah, I mean, but I think about socialism in relation to this country. I think about the fact that self-driving cars is hanging over our country like a curse, right? They talk about how pretty soon there could be self-driving cars. And in a rational society, in a society where the economy was organized rationally, that would be a good thing. It would mean all kinds of people who spent their days driving a truck or driving as an Uber driver or, working in traffic court or whatever, they could do something else. And we could have a more productive society with this burden of the human labor of driving being eliminated from the economy. It would free up human labor to do more other productive things. It would be good overall. But we know that in capitalism, self-driving cars would be an economic disaster. It would lead to, thousands and millions of people being out of work. It would lead to riots in the streets. What sense does that make? Why do we have an economic system where technological progress leads to greater poverty? This is what Karl Marx was writing about. This is the problem of the capitalist system, that the more efficient technology becomes, the more efficient production and the ability of machines to advance, the more efficient it becomes, the poorer people get. There's an old story they tell of like a little boy, and he's very, very cold. And he says to his father, why is it so cold? And he says, because we can't afford any coal to heat our stove. It's back in the days of, of coal stoves to heat your home. And he says, I can't afford any coal to heat the stove. And the boy says to his father, why can't you afford any coal? And he says, because I lost my job at the coal mine. And the boy says, Dad, why did you lose your job at the coal mine? He said, because there's too much coal. That's capitalism, right? It's a system of production organized for profit. In systems of the past, people were hungry because there were food shortages. But only under capitalism do people go hungry because there's too much food. In systems of the past, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. But only under capitalism do people become homeless because there's too much housing. And if you look at the financial crisis, 2008, the housing bubble burst, what was happening? There was too much housing, right? And Americans couldn't afford to keep buying it the way they used to. And Alan Greenspan legalized all kinds of easy credit to try and keep us buying houses, even though our wages and living conditions have gone down. But it only worked for so long. And pretty soon we had people living on the street, and tent cities were popping up across the country because there were too many houses. That's the irrationality of capitalism. And socialism is when we reorganize the economy to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. It's when you have central planning and you organize the economy and you make sure that the needs of the people come first, and growth is then no longer restricted by the irrationality of capitalism. You can have unlimited growth, and we don't have this problem, the boom-bust cycle, where growth inevitably leads to poverty, and poverty amid plenty is a reality. It's about overcoming the irrationality of the market and putting human reason in control of the means of production.
Caleb, I once heard it stated like this, that in a capitalist society, a house is built because you've got to sell wood and bricks, because somebody has to sell the house and they've got to get a part of that, because somebody has to do a mortgage and the bank's got to get a part of that. And everybody's making profit off the house. But then in a socialist system, a house is built because people need houses to live in. That's the simplest way that it was put to me.
And that is ultimately correct, right? The essence of capitalism, some people think capitalism means inequality. Some people think capitalism means having money or having wealth. The essence of capitalism is the economy being centered around profits. It's production organized according to profits in command. That is the capitalist system. Socialism is when society takes command, or the community takes command. And we say we're going to organize the economy. We're going to force the economy to work in the interest of the public. Now, 21st century socialism, as you saw in Venezuela, or as we see in China or in other countries, 21st century socialism has a place for the market. There's a lot of private hotels. There's a lot of private restaurants. There's even private tech startup firms. And I think there's a role for the market in society. But the point is that the market must be subordinated. The banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, need to be operated for the good of the public. You need to have 5-year economic plans. You need to make sure that the economy doesn't run rampant, but instead the needs of the people come first. And that's what socialism is really about.
Interesting. Let me give out the number. We're talking with Caleb Maupin. And Caleb's also an author. He's written a number of books, and he advocates for socialism. And we are trying to learn together about socialism and actually what it is. I'm not advocating for or against it, but I think when people scream out socialism, it's a good idea to know what it is. And not just, look, for years in the U.S., here's what we get. Socialism is evil. Socialism is evil. Socialism is evil. It comes from a perspective of good versus evil rather than informative. This is what it is. This is what, we can see what capitalism is every day. We live with it. You can like it or not like it. It is what it is, but also to learn from a person who advocates for socialism, which is Caleb Maupin, his perspective of what it is and how it works. The number, we're taking phone calls. The number is 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735. We've got open lines. You're listening to Garland Nixon at Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, just plain old Garland Nixon on Facebook. Garland N, that's my first name and the first letter of my last name. GarlandN@gmail.com is my email address. 818-985 5735. Any questions for Caleb Maupin about this socialism thing, what it is and how it works? Now, one of the things I'll say this, Caleb, while we're waiting on calls, I'm sure we'll get some calls. Got a lot of great listeners. And feel free, wherever you're coming from, we want to hear from it. We want to hear about it. Caleb, one of the things that I think is important to do to examine neoliberalism, because we hear the word capitalism in the same way that someone says, hey, there's an apple. Well, what kind of apple? Is it a Granny Smith apple? Is it a Roma apple? Is it a Pink Lady apple? There's different kind of apples. In the same way, there's different kinds of socialism, different kinds of capitalism. And right now, what we are living through is a neoliberal capitalism that seems quite predatory. Your thoughts of the current state of capitalism? And here's my question. Is this the natural place that capitalism is going to end up anyway? Or is this just some different version? Anyway, your thoughts on that capitalism as we see it today, neoliberal capitalism, Caleb Maupin.
Sure. Well, a lot of people think that socialism is when the government does stuff. Capitalism is when the market does stuff. The USA is half socialist because we have a post office and stuff. Well, I don't accept that. Right. I mean, that every capitalist society in history has had roads that were paid for by the government. The U.S. Constitution says we have to have a government-run post office in order to facilitate the market, and redistribution of wealth in the form of taxation, social programs, corporate subsidies, government involvement in the economy to some degree. That's just been accepted as just a standard part of capitalism operating since the beginning of time. Since the beginning of the capitalist system, at least. It was really starting in the 1970s and then really escalating after the fall of the Soviet Union. You got a rise in this kind of thinking that was really put forward by Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan and others, that this notion, well, the government can stay out of things. Things that used to be done by the state can now be done by private corporations.
And you know what, Caleb, I hate to break into it, but guess what? There is some good news. Our lines are lighting up, buddy. Everybody wants to hear what you have to say, and we really want to get everybody involved. So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're here for. Let's go. We're going to start. Morris on line 1. Morris, you're on the air with Garland, Nixon, and Caleb Maupin.
Hey, good discussion. I want to ask a question. With Social Security, universal health care, public education, child tax credit, Section 8 vouchers, would all that stuff be considered socialism? I'll take your comments off the air.
Thank you very much. I couldn't make that out very well, Caleb. Could you?
I couldn't either. I couldn't understand. I think he said something about Social Security, which is a program that was won as a result of the class struggle. In the 1930s, workers went out on strike. They demanded, health care and jobs, and you had the sit-down strike wave. And that's how Social Security was won as a result of struggle led by socialists and communists back in the 1930s.
Yeah, it's interesting. What's funny? And let me add this we're getting ready to go to our next caller, but I'll say this. When FDR was putting the New Deal in place, the Social Security, all the things, the banking regulations, etc., the powerful capitalists were so upset that they put together a plan to overthrow the government of the United States. And the reason it failed was because there was a guy, what's the name? He wrote the book, the guy that wrote the book, War is a Racket.
Smedley Butler.
Smedley Butler, they came and got Smedley Butler to lead the overthrow of the United States, and he ratted him out because he was a Marine and he felt his responsibility to the President of the United States. They were going to overthrow the government of the United States because they said basically FDR doing Social Security and roads and things of that nature was communism. Same thing happened with the Great Society. That's communism. It's going to destroy our country. We have an element in this country that doesn't want the government to do anything to help the poor and the working class. Next. Bella, line 2. You're on, Bella.
Hey, Garland and Caleb, I thank you so much. I am a socialist, and there's a difference between people that call themselves progressives and socialists. So we need to distinguish. In all the media, the corporate media in this country, they speak of the left. The left does not represent me. I am a socialist. I am on the far left. I am a radical. And I am registered with the Peace and Freedom Party of California, the only socialist electoral party registered in California. and they run their socialist candidates. It would be nice, Garland, if you can bring these voices on the air. And I appreciate your guest and this topic. And Garland, you keep rocking. Thank you so much. Bella Pisoto.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it. I believe, Caleb, that people need to learn, that people need to understand what their options are out there, and they can choose as they want. Somebody's going to tell you something's evil. It may be evil. It may not, but you need to understand for yourself. Let's go to John on line 4. John, you're on with Caleb Maupin and Garland Nixon.
Hey, Caleb. Hey, Garland. So I just want to ask, because I'm not very familiar with either system, what would be the major difference between communism and socialism?
Great question, John. Thank you. All right, Caleb.
Well, the understanding is that socialism is the first stage. Socialism is a society like Cuba or Venezuela or China, where the means of production are controlled by society. But there's still inequality in such societies. Some people have more than others. It's a transitional stage. Socialism is the first stage. Communism is the ultimate ideal. Communism is a world where technology has advanced so much and so much wealth has been created that inequality kind of fades away. Everyone has enough, and there's no need for anyone to hoard from anybody else. The need for a government kind of fades away. People are able to live life based on just kind of doing what they feel like doing and taking what they want, from each according to their own ability to each according to their needs. Communism is the ultimate goal. It is, probably hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in the future. But it is the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world based on so much wealth. The road to that, though, is taking control of the economy, having a rationally organized economy. Because the problem with capitalism is not that it creates growth. And that's one of, the previous caller talked about progressives. And yeah, I don't identify with the progressives. A lot of what's going around these days coming from so-called leftists is stuff I don't agree with. The problem with capitalism isn't that it creates growth. The problem is it holds back growth. It holds back human creativity. It holds back human brilliance. And socialism is about unleashing human creativity, unleashing productivity, and reaching that ultimate stage of a world with so much wealth where inequality can fade away.
Interesting. So it's like an ideal, and we're like that. Hopefully, you do this, and one day maybe it'll eventually get you to wherever the case may. I never knew that, Caleb. I'm glad you told us. Next, we're going to Steve. Steve, you're on line 5.
Hello, gentlemen. Interesting program. I'm just thinking, here in the United States, socialism has such a negative context with a lot of folks. Maybe they need to start calling it something else.
Go ahead.
Some other terminology other than socialism.
Well, that there's something to be said for that, right? And I think that we do need to make clear that, the problems of the Soviet Union did lead to its fall. I think the Soviet Union achieved a lot of great things, defeating the Nazis, inventing space travel, raising their people up from poverty. But clearly, the Soviet Union had big problems that led to its fall, and that China has adjusted their socialist system quite a bit. It's not the same socialism you had during the Mao era. So, there's a need to make clear we don't want to repeat the past. But the other thing, though, is that, if we were to just give it a different name, right, if we would say, well, no, this isn't, we don't believe in socialism. We believe in babada or something like that. Pretty soon, two things would happen. One thing is whatever babada was would be demonized, and we hear, that was evil. And second of all, somebody would probably come along and get a book and open that book and say, wait a second, this babada sounds an awful lot like communism and socialism, and you lied to us. So honestly, you have to be honest in politics. And honestly, we do have to defend the record. I have heard my whole life that socialism never achieved anything. It failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And it was learning that that's just a big lie, and learning that socialism, made China what it is today. It used to be one of the poorest countries in the world, the sick man of Asia. Now it's a superpower. Socialism did that, learning that it was socialism that made Cuba an island in the Caribbean that has a healthcare system that is admired all over the world. Socialism did that. And that we do have to go up against the historical record. We can't just simply disown the history, and we have to fight for the truth, which is that it's Western capitalism that is unpaving the roads. We're unpaving the roads in 27 different states right now. Municipalities can't afford paved roads. Meanwhile, it's socialism that's built high-speed railway all over the world. In China, look at what they're doing.
Thank you very much.
Don't they have socialism in Northern European countries that they actually do call socialism, though?
Oh, guess what? If I'm not mistaken, the country of Portugal is run the coalition in Portugal is led by the Communist Party. Am I wrong? Am I wrong?
The Communist Party is a very big part of the coalition government now in Portugal. Now, I would argue that Portugal, Norway, Sweden, these are countries that have what you can call social democracy or a welfare state. They're still a capitalist economy, but there is a bigger welfare state. In Portugal, the Communist Party is part of the government, and it is trying to push Portugal in the direction of moving towards socialism. They're not there yet, though. I would say they're part of the ruling coalition.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Sweden and
Norway
are working. Sweden and Norway are working pretty well, though, right?
Yep. Well, thanks a lot, Steve. Well, they were until such time as recently they've been pushed in a very bad direction by the U.S. empire, and they're going down the tubes too, sadly. But thanks a lot, Steve. We got a bunch of callers, and that's awesome. Lynette on line 3. Lynette, you're on.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. Thanks for this conversation. I wanted to pose a question, though.
I'm sorry, Lynette, we're not hearing you. Can you maybe hold your mouth a little closer to the receiver? We're not hearing you well, and make sure you're not on a speakerphone.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I think we've lost
Poland
Lynette.
is supposed to be suing Germany for reparations behind what happened, World War II, right? And, I'm just like,
unfortunately,
they also are trying to go fascist. And that's the way I look at America. America wants to eat.
I'm sorry, Lynette. Unfortunately,
they want to be imperialist, but they want to be this democracy. And at some point, and I know I'm preaching to the choir right now. At some point, the truth, you have to deal with the truth, because that's the only thing that's going to set you free. And they're going to have to come to terms with their role in making this whole global system what it is, and predatory capitalism what it is, because right now we have a plutocracy duopoly, and we need to get the independents and the Greens and everybody together and just make a whole nother party and just dismantle this whole thing and bring real democracy to the world, like we say.
All right, thank you very much, Lynette. We struggled a little bit hearing Lynette, but we understood. And Caleb, before we go to the next caller, I'll say this. What we hear from Lynette, what we hear from so many people, Caleb, is this. People intuitively understand that the system we're looking in is broken. When I can see mansions with helipads and mansions with pools, and then I drive down the street and under every bridge abutment there's a tent with an impoverished person who doesn't have decent food to eat or a roof over their head, intuitively we understand there's something definitely wrong with this system, Caleb.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's becoming very abundantly clear. And I think that more than anti-communism or the propaganda now, we're up against demoralization. They want all of us to be hopeless. They want all of us to think there's nothing we can do. And they want us to hate ourselves more than anything. They want us to think that human beings are just inherently evil, inherently selfish. There's no way out of this. They're trying to turn us against each other more than they're trying to turn us against socialism.
Yeah, we're supposed to hate other races. Oh, no, that person voted for Trump. We got to hate Trump supporters. That person's a Republican. That person's a Democrat. That person's a socialist. These are all reasons to hate each other. Meanwhile, the billionaires are laughing all the way to the bank. Let's go to Danny on, I believe that's Christian next. Christian on line 1. Christian, you're on. No Christian? You still there, Caleb?
I'm here.
All right. Well, Christian, going once, going twice. All right. Unfortunately, no Christian. Let's go to Danny on line 7. Danny, you're on.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. There was a good segue talking about the people. We talk a lot about government and business, but the role of the individual isn't seen to get talked about in socialism, at least in this conversation. We talked about China's success, but, China will, there's a commitment to the greater good by all the individuals over the individual, wherein they'll flood out a valley, full of people for the greater good. In America, we have the individualism. There's so much individualism that, how do you rectify that difference in China, they just stopped allowing teenagers or kids to play video games only 4 hours a week, and they infringe upon those rights. So because it's for the greater good. So how do you reconcile individual liberty with socialism when it takes a village to make socialism?
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let me add that. Let me throw something out to that, Caleb, before you respond. A big part of how you judge a government, I don't care what you call it, is does it meet the needs of the people? You can call it apples and potatoes. Ultimately, does it meet the needs of the people? And this is what I keep saying, if you look at China, anywhere between U.S. polls say anywhere between 86 and 95% of the people in China approve of their government. If you got those kind of numbers, it doesn't matter what you call it. Whatever you're doing, it is the people are in favor of it, and it certainly would those numbers make sense because they pulled 800 million people out of poverty. So the idea about individual liberties or individual rights, A, cultures are different, and B, man, you can't eat individual liberties and individual rights. And if you're starving and you're hungry one day and you wake up and your government's put you've got health care and your kids are going to school and you got a job and you're not in dire poverty with no running water and no heat anymore, you're gonna take that, Caleb.
Well, I would say look at any item in a store. Go to a store and look at any item. There's not a single item you can find that one person can point to and say, I made that all by myself. Every item is the result of all kinds of collective efforts by human beings. Production nowadays, people are working together and coordinating and cooperating to carry out, the modern economy. They're doing it collectively. The thing is, they're doing it in order to make profits that are privately accumulated, and that we are a highly collective species. I personally think that there's definitely room for individual liberty and individual initiative in socialism. And the way they do things in China, they call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the only type of socialism we'd ever have here in America would be some kind of socialism with American characteristics, rooted in our own culture, our own traditions. And I think it would be very important, and it would emphasize individual liberties and rights. But that said, we are a collective species. We do work together. And the entire history of human beings has been us operating as a collective species. And capitalism wants us all to think we're all individuals. We're all just atomized individuals. That's a big part of the liberal mentality that we have now in our society. And as a result, people are dying. I mean, the suicide rate, the drug addiction rate. I mean, we think of ourselves as just atomized individuals with our own brand, our own Facebook, our own Twitter, and it's leading to, a real loss. People define themselves in relation to groups that they're in relation to other people, and being part of a country, being part of a family, being part of a class, being part of a community, being part of a political party. And so the radical individualism of our society has a lot of problems, and I think countering it is not necessarily a bad thing. But that to be said, I understand your concern about some of the collectivism of China and why you think it wouldn't be good for over here.
Well, our lines are packed. Let's go to Dave on line 8. Dave, you're on. Dave, you are on. I guess we don't have Dave.
Hello?
Okay, Dave.
Hi. I just donated to KPFK, and I want to make sure that the credit goes to you because your program is so valuable, and the programs that you do on other platforms are so important to me right now during this Ukraine tragic comedy. I don't know what to call it. And speaking of Venezuela, I'm hearing that the United States is approaching Venezuela now and saying, well, maybe we'll lift those sanctions we have on you. Maybe we can do some business now. And I think we have, I think we have the Russian Federation to thank in part for that change in policy. What do you and Caleb think?
Your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, I think that, the Trump administration was focused on fighting Venezuela, fighting Cuba, and fighting Iran. And the Biden administration has been focused on escalating things with Russia. And these are divisions in the ruling class. When you enter a long-term capitalist crisis, when the capitalist system starts breaking down, you get divisions among the ruling elite. And that I think that's one of the divisions. Which country do we go after? So now that Russia seems to be who Biden's focused on going after. He's getting a little bit closer to Venezuela. He's saying maybe we can import some of your oil to make up for the Russian oil we're not getting. These are divisions in the ruling class. But at the end of the day, all the big corporations want to crush Venezuela. They want to crush Iran. They want to crush Russia. They want to crush China. They want global dominance.
And let me say this before we go to the next caller. There's something to understand about this. Russia has, because people just think, oh, well, Putin's bad or Assad's bad or Maduro's bad. They get this good and evil Marvel Comics foolishness. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans buy it. Here's what you have to understand. And tell me if you agree with this, Caleb. There's an element in the U.S. ruling class that deals with commodities, oil, gold, diamonds. Russia has a lot of gold and diamonds and oil and commodities. There's another element in the ruling class that deals with industry, right? What does China have? Industry. That's the separation. The ruling class that wants to control all the oil and gold and commodities in the world wants to overthrow Russia. The element in the ruling class that wants to control all the industry in the world wants to overthrow China. That's as simple as it is. All of this fluff about Putin's a good guy or a bad guy, or China's not doing good things or bad things, disguises the lies that this is about the elite ruling class stealing the commodities or industry of other countries and giving you lies to drag you along so you'll sacrifice your life on their behalf. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah, well, it's important to point out, regardless of whatever criticisms you want to make of Putin, the reason that he's so popular in Russia is because when the fall of the Soviet Union happened and they implemented free market capitalist policies under Yeltsin in the 90s, it ruined the country. It was a disaster. I mean, people were starving and dying. It was a nightmare, the free market neoliberal policies in Russia in the 90s. When Putin got into office, he fixed Russia's economy. And the way he fixed it was by putting it centered around oil and gas that was controlled by the state. They have two state-controlled mega corporations in Russia, Gazprom, that sells natural gas, and Rosneft, that sells oil. And the Russian economy is centered around those two state-controlled energy corporations. And it's with state control of natural resources that Putin's been able to fix Russia's economy and really improve living conditions over the past several decades. And that's why he's very, very popular. And that's also why Wall Street and London hate him, because now Russia used to be a deeply impoverished country that was falling apart during the 90s with free market policies. Now it's competing with them. And every ounce of oil and gas they sell is an ounce of oil and gas somebody didn't buy from BP or Chevron or ExxonMobil, and that's why they hate him.
Let's get a couple more calls. Jarnell on line 4. Jarnell, you're on.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call. Forgive my ignorance, but part of the problem I see with any system is that people too often want to see all the changes within their own lifetime. I believe that a lot of China's success is based on making plans 40, 50, 100 years ahead. It wasn't that long ago that they had the one-child policy, and that lent a great deal to their current success. Now they want to build a waterway from the south to the north, another 50-year plan. These sorts of plans aren't possible in a capitalistic society because everybody is trying to get rich in their lifetime.
Yeah, well, let me, and I hate to cut you off, but I want to try to get another couple more calls. Caleb, you got a quick comment for that before we jump to our next call?
Sure. I think the one-child policy in China was a mistake, but I do think the caller is right about the fact that that long-term planning is much more possible when you have a socialist economy. Capitalism, it is about short-term gain. Absolutely.
Destiny on line 5. Destiny, you're on the air.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Destiny.
Okay, great. So I am a young 20-something in America, and I was just wondering what your advice is, both Garland and Caleb, because I feel that I'm being pushed in kind of only two boxes, which is either liberal or like Democratic, and Republican, and I don't really feel like I connect with either of those things, and I also feel like it's been extremely hard for me to find information that's not biased on either of those things because of, like you guys have been talking about, like socialism, for example, here is like I've always looked at it as like really close to like what is the one, not capitalism, but the other one that's like really bad. The one that's where it's like all like in China, where it's like North Korea, it's like kind of compared to that, and there's just like not any information out there for us. And, like, my family is very Republican, very Trump supporter, and the way that they talk is just so confusing, and they just are all full of biases and stuff that they, like, saw on Facebook. And I just want, like, clear information on how to make an informed decision that's not biased. I do want to be involved in politics, but I feel like the reason why so many young people are not is because we're so overwhelmed with, like, good, bad, and you get two boxes, which is, like, Democrat or Republican. So I just wanted to know if you guys had any advice for young people out there that are trying to just get good, solid information to be able to make an informed decision, because I feel like more young people would be involved if it wasn't so.
All right. And I hate to cut you off,
polarized.
Destiny, but we're running short of time. Hey, and so I do want to get some other things. Hey, Caleb, I've heard it put like this when you talk about the Republican and the Democratic Party, that basically it's like sitting in a restaurant and you're choosing your waiter. Do you want the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? That's your waiter. The food is cooked in the same kitchen. The food is cooked by the same people. You have the same options on the menu. You're just deciding which waiter or waitress is going to bring you your food. Caleb.
Well, my advice for Destiny would be to look beyond Western capitalism, look beyond American media. You know, check out RT, check out CGTN, check out Sputnik Radio, check out media coming from around the world, because it's pretty clear our society here in the United States is coming apart, and the same for Western Europe.
Telesur is good. Venezuela. You ever watch Telesur?
Yeah.
And let me say this. I read the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I also read RT and Sputnik and Press TV and and CGTN. In order to get a well-rounded view, you have to read the things that they tell you to read and read the things that they tell you not to read. That way you can put two and two together on your own and make your own decisions.
And one thing I would add for Destiny also is, your Trump supporting relatives, I think a lot of what they want is not incompatible with socialism. I mean, Trump's whole thing is going to make America great again. Well, it was China. China was made great again by socialism. I mean, that was very clear. That was the beginning of the great revival in China. And that, if we want a country where people have jobs, healthcare, and education, where economic prosperity is happening, where we're not having wars around the world to make profits for corporations, I mean, that's what socialism is. And I think that a lot of the people in the Trump camp, they see the Joe Biden forces and that they're kind of waging a culture war. They think that's what socialism is. Well, go to China, go to Venezuela, go to Cuba. I mean, go to the countries around the world that are building socialism. It has nothing to do with the Joe Biden, Kamala Harris agenda.
Well, Caleb, we're just about out of time, but my gosh, the lines, I'm going to have to get you back on because I'm looking and the lines are still packed, but we're out of time because people have questions. They want to know what's different. You got a website, Pedro? I keep saying Pedro. Caleb?
Oh, well, I'm part of the Center for Political Innovation. You can check out our website, cpiusa.org. That's cpiusa.org. You can also follow me. I stream on YouTube. My name is Caleb Maupin, CalebMaupin. I stream on YouTube. I'm on Twitter, etc. Caleb Maupin.
And my name's Garland Nixon, and we are out of time. I want to thank KPFK for giving me the option to come on here and give people a different perspective. At Garland Nixon on Twitter, Garland.Nixon on Instagram, just plain old Garland Nixon on Facebook. Follow me on YouTube. Follow me at Rockfin, ROKFIN.com. Email me. It's GarlandN, my first name and the first letter of my last name, GarlandN@gmail.com. Peace. I'm out. Oh, and by the way, thanks a lot, Yaddle, for doing another fantastic job. I'm out.
There's a lot to be thankful for. If you're thankful for the old family vehicle, you can let it help one more time by donating it to the KPFK Vehicle Donation Program. The proceeds will help KPFK continue the quality programming you depend on throughout the year. The vehicle donation number is 877-KPFK-AUTO. That's 877-573-5288. Our representative will take care of everything. That number again is 877-KPFK-AUTO or donate online at kpfk.org.
Hey, this is Wanda Sykes, and you're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles. And if you'd like to shell out a few bucks, keep us up and running so I can have nice conversation in a cool voice like this, pick up the phone and call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Thank you.
90.7 KPFK, Los Angeles.
Since 1959, Southern California's progressive radio, KPFK.